All right, we're going to start the meeting of the Licensing Committee of the California Board of Psychology at 9 o'clock in the morning in Sacramento, California on Tuesday, April 24th. Would you please call roll?
Absolutely. Fu? Here. Horn?
Here.
Phillips?
Present.
All present and accounted for.
Okay, everybody is present and accounted for, as Mr. Glass-Steagall said. So before we get started, I just want to read the goal of this committee, just to remind folks what the licensing committee does. The goal of this committee is to ensure valid licensing, continuing education, and licensure renewal policies and procedures, making recommendations for changes as appropriate. The committee will also ensure a valid and reliable examination process to assess professional knowledge, as well as the laws and ethics governing the profession, working with such entities as the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards, ASPPB, and the Department of Consumer Affairs Offices of Professional Examination Services. So that's what the licensing committee does within the larger body of the Board of Psychology. Our first order of business is to ask if there are any public comments for items that aren't on today's agenda. We won't be able to discuss these items today, but can place them on a future agenda for discussion. Any public comment about that? Seeing none, let's move on to approval of the Licensing Committee meeting minutes of January 22nd, 2018. Everybody okay with them?
I actually have one comment, which is at line 328.
What page is it on? Do you know?
9 of 530.
It's actually 12 of 533. 28.
320.
Okay.
It said, it's discussing what Mr. Fu had asked about, how many complaints are filed against non-psychological assistants, which I don't think really means anything. I think what you're asking is people that were not registered as psychological assistants were registered. Perhaps unregistered pre-licensed, I don't want to say professionals, but
Trainees?
Trainees, yeah,
Okay.
trainees.
That's much more precise and gets to the question we were looking for. So, thank you.
Okay, I had some just grammatical changes and edits that I'll submit, nothing substantive that I'll submit. So would anybody like to move the acceptance?
I'll move that we approve the minutes as amended.
And I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded that the minutes be approved as amended. Any more discussion about that? Any public discussion about that? All right, seeing none, Mr. Glass-Steagall.
Fu?
Aye.
Horn?
Aye.
Phillips?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, thank you. All right, next item on the agenda, the qualifications for the examination subject matter experts. And so, Ms. Snyder, you'll come up.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi there.
My name is Lavinia Snyder. I am the examination coordinator for the Board of Psychology. And the next item on the agenda is the examination subject matter experts qualification. At the last licensing committee meeting, we had talked about revising the forms. The basically the SME email invitation, the SME application, and the SME participation confirmation. And also, I guess something, information was brought up to the committee the last time also that we were prohibiting state or government employees from participating in our SME workshops. Actually, that isn't correct. I mean, we allow them, but we need additional information from them, from their Human Resources Department to ensure that there is no conflict of interest, that there is no violation of the Government Code 19990. And I've attached a copy of the Government Code with the packet, and that's attachment D. So would the committee like to go over the application again, or are there any changes, additions?
So let me just say that you sent this out to us to take a look at, and we made our suggestions and recommendations. So I think probably let's just look over and make sure that it, what is here is what we
Sure.
asked Ms. Snyder to do.
Before you start that, I would like to add on the SME application, and that is attachment C in your packet. Oh, no, I'm sorry, attachment B in your packet. I would
B?
like to add a question there that basically asks, are you currently a government employee? And then just add an explanation why we need that information.
Perfect.
So.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I just want to say thank you to Ms. Schneider for being so patient with us. And I think this application that's before us today is an improvement just in many different ways, including the inclusion of the question about race and aligning that with federal and state guidelines. I think that brings us into conformity and does allow us to track that data in a meaningful way for those who do decide to disclose. And it's a reminder that it's optional and it's not a part of the decision, but it is just for our collection purposes to better understand who is reviewing the exam. So thank you for that.
Sure.
And I think ultimately the object of that is to make sure that we're using a diverse group of subject matter experts to the extent possible, so that there's not a misrepresentation of any group within the total group of subject matter experts. Again, I would like to add for Ms. Snyder, thank you very much for the process you took. You sent it to each of us. We had an opportunity to make our comments. It then got passed on to the next person. I thought it was a really efficient way of doing it, and I really appreciated the way that you went about it. So thank you very much for that. I did have a question, clarification on the application. And I think I've even asked this question before, but I don't remember the answer, so you'll have to bear with me. It's on the application. It's the first question. It says, do you hold an active valid license in good standing with no prior or pending disciplinary actions? My understanding of actions would be anything where we actually took action, whether it's to file an accusation or something of that nature. It wouldn't boil down to somebody just having had a complaint against them.
No.
Is that correct? Okay, thanks. Because it doesn't feel fair if somebody had a complaint and it wasn't worth
That's
pursuing, that should
Right.
prohibit them from proceeding on the panel.
So I agree. Thanks so much, Ms. Snyder. I think this was, it was a really great process. I think your suggestion to add that one additional question is really good as well, and it was very efficient. We got it done, so I
Would
think
the
the whole
committee
thing.
like to see that last, the revision before I hand it over to legal for approval?
I don't
we
think
need to
there's
do it
any
after?
need for us to see it. You could probably check it and
Okay.
just make sure that everything is good on it. I think it doesn't need to be brought back, so thanks so much. Do we need to move anything?
I just remembered one tiny comment I wanted to mention to you. Under forensic, where it says type of practice on the application, would be the last page of the application, where you say, please specify below.
Yeah.
I think maybe we should be a little bit more specific and please specify type of forensics below.
What page are you on?
I think it would be page 20 of 533.
I don't see forensic. Oh,
See, it says
Oh,
please
forensic.
specify below.
yeah.
Just to make it clear to people what they're specifying. Because obviously there's people that are forensic that work within a prison population. There are people that do civil forensics. There's people that do criminal forensics. There's,
So what are you saying? I'm not sure what you're saying. What are you asking that?
let's say please specify type of forensics below.
Oh, okay,
Just so it's clear what we're asking them to specify.
okay. And so general clinic, type of practice. I think in general clinic, we want probably populations, right?
Yeah.
Client population or something. Please specify client population or something like that.
And maybe the same thing with behavioral medicine.
Mhm.
But I don't think we need to see this again
I don't either.
before it goes to legal.
Ms. Marks?
Yeah, I just have a couple comments. In a couple places, you refer to the per diem fee, and in one case, per diem honorarium. I think it would probably be more accurate to simply call it a per diem salary. Per diem fee almost sounds like we're charging them. And an honorarium isn't quite accurate, so that'd be one comment to correct that. And then the other question I had is, do you also ask them whether or not they work for the state in order to make sure that they're not violating any overtime laws? Is there a check as to that?
No, I didn't include that. Should-
Okay, I just suggest that you check with HR
Okay.
to make sure that that is not also an issue, and one of the reasons we ask for whether or not they are otherwise employed by the state.
Thank you.
Okay.
Anything else?
Well, I'm going to ask that in a second. Do we need a motion to go ahead and accept this as edited and then?
You can, I don't really think so. It's not particularly an action of the committee. You're not necessarily recommending it because it's, unless you simply want to recommend it to the board for approval because of the items that are more discretionary, like the practice areas that you're asking about, then you can do that.
Well, it's going to come to the board anyway, right?
Oh, I guess it would.
Okay, so
I guess it
I
would.
don't think a motion is necessary then. Okay, so is there any public discussion about this recruitment of subject matter experts and the application for subject matter experts for the exam? Seeing none. Thanks so much. This is really great. I'll look forward to it going through everything it needs to go through to get out there and start using it. Plus, I like the invitation a lot better, too. I think it's, yeah, so. All right, next item, number 5, standardization of trainee categories, and this was, this is in line with our pathways to licensure, and so Ms. Chung, you want to kind of take us through this a little bit?
Absolutely.
In line with our pathways to licensure, one of the things that staff asked us to look at, and we got feedback about, let me say we got a lot of feedback about, was the recommendation to make all the training categories psychological assistant categories. So you want to take us through that, and we'll kind of take like each part, because we got, again, a lot of feedback, so.
Sounds good. I will put the item 5 in a little bit of content, so to bring everybody on the same page again.
Yeah.
Could you move the microphone closer to you?
Definitely.
Okay, thanks.
Is it better? Item 5, included in your materials, we have included a proposal A that at the last meeting, staff has proposed to the committee. What this proposal about is to standardize the current trainee category. As you can see on the memo, there are currently 5 different ways for a trainee to gain the experience necessarily for licensure. The first one is for them to register with the board as a psych assistant. Second is to become a registered psychologist with the board, or gain their experience during exam settings such as academic institutions or any governmental organizations, or they can gain experience through a formal doctoral internship or placement that is overseen by the APA, APIC, and KPIC, or they can earn their hours using Department of Mental Health waiver. So what happened is even though the common goal for them is to gain hours, so the oversight and the settings, requirements, and the processes can be varied. So staff has proposed that maybe it's a better idea to have consumer protection and accountability and holding them accountable as a big picture to propose a proposal that will require all the trainees to register with the board. And the idea of that coming is to recommend to have them register as psych assistant. So then at the last meeting, it feels is like a very huge undertake. So the committee has tasked staff to solicit stakeholders' feedback. So then we work with Solid to develop 3 surveys. So this is the survey results that will include that in the attachment that follows the memo. And I just want to run through the attachment in case you were wondering, because there's some redaction throughout the surveys. So those responses actually include some information related to enforcement issues. So we just want to redact that for that purpose.
Thanks so much for that explanation. So let me say I don't want to say overwhelming amount of feedback, but we got a lot of feedback on this issue. And based on the issue we got, the feedback we got from the survey, the feedback I think we also got in Northern California when we talked about this issue and the different aspects of trainees. And I just want to give a shout out at this time to Dr. Emus, who really gave us a very thorough explanation of what you do at CDRC and your training, the kind of training you provide, and the process that you do for that your trainees go through. It was really, I think, very informative. Really want to thank you for doing that, and really quite an excellent process. So just want to say that little thing. I don't think there's really any need to go over all the feedback, but at this point in time, but in my reading of it, and based on the feedback we got, I think, again, at the Northern California stakeholder meeting, we might have gotten this at the Southern California as well. You might remember, Stephen, but there was what it seems to me is that based on this feedback, it would not be a good idea to roll all the categories into one, but that it probably would still be a good idea to take away the registered psychologist one and roll that into, those people become psych assistants.
You know, I would agree with that, and obviously there was a lot of comments to go through here, but people raised really wonderful points, I think, in terms of training models for people that are out of state as opposed to people that are in state, expenses that would be attendant to this process, the possibility of needing more supervisors when agencies are restricted on the amount of supervisors that they can actually have on staff. So I thought there were a lot of wonderful things brought up, and I was left with the same conclusion you were, which is I think the registered psychologist label is a misnomer. They're not a psychologist of any type because they're not a licensed psychologist yet. They haven't completed that process. So I think making them into psychological assistants to that extent, rolling those two categories together, I think, would make a lot of sense. I think before we talked about the possibility that we would use differential pricing depending on the setting, although I don't know that that's really practical. And might create a lot of resentment. I also think it became clear from looking at the comments that rolling these all into one category was also going to create some internal institutional problems in terms of resources and in terms of delays. Although there were several comments that indicated that there was a great delay in psychological assistant applications, the reality is that's not true.
That's not true.
Once people have all the paperwork in, I think it takes less than 14 days for people to become psychological assistants. So I think people were reacting to historical information.
Yeah.
There were also some interesting comments made about the board and that we don't protect consumers, which I thought was a little off the wall. But in general, I thought the comments were very, very helpful. And I really appreciate the time that people took in explaining to us why this would create so many problems for different types of institutions.
And similar lines of thinking in terms of the outstanding responses, the outstanding number of responses we received. I am struck by this. I think there were this conflation between the use of the category psychological assistant and the intent of staff's proposal, which is, from my perspective, to make sure that there's a measure of oversight across different categories, but in looping them potentially under the category, the nomenclature of psychological assistant, it seemed to impress upon different folks different attributions that they may see differently than what we normally would see. So I think in terms of going back to the original intent of the proposal, which is how do we think about oversight of these different categories, it could be that the responses we received were associated with the attributes of a psychological assistant nomenclature versus potentially that if there were different categories per se that all had to be registered still with the board but with a different title of some sort, we may have had a different response. So I think that's where I saw in the comments when I dug through was folks were responding more to the attributes and title of psychological assistant if they weren't a registered one because they are gaining their training experience elsewhere. And I think that gives me a pause in terms of thinking through this. How do we still bring in different folks, to staff's point, about the variance in where folks are doing their work and training and how we can potentially still have the ability to a measure of oversight.
Let me ask staff this question, Ms. Chung in particular. If somebody were, for instance, in a formal internship under APIC, KPIC, APA, whatever the case might be, and a consumer made a complaint to us about the services that were provided by that intern. Because that's what we're really talking about, is protecting consumers and making sure that people are accountable to consumers for the services they give. That's our primary purpose as a board. But if they were to make that complaint, would that be taken as a complaint against their licensed supervisor?
Yes.
So it would still be able to hear that complaint, even though we wouldn't necessarily be able to take disciplinary action against the trainee, correct?
Yes, I believe so. If Ms. Sora can add to the enforcement side of it.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that when it would impact the trainee is when they fill out an application for licensure, and then it may be a denial of an application based on a complaint that we received about the provision of the services that they provided and a consumer complaint that we received.
That was finally adjudicated to be a legitimate consumer complaint.
Correct.
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 Okay. So there is a level of accountability there. As I was thinking about this whole thing, the thing that struck me was when I was getting trained, which is not that long ago. It's long enough. It's long enough. And maybe I've got the wrong historical perspective, but my understanding always was the reason that the board was more concerned about psychological assistance is because they were oftentimes not in traditional settings like a university or an internship program, but rather were somebody working with somebody in a private practice. And they wanted to make sure that there was some kind of specific organized plan for training that person, for giving them additional information, for preparing them to be an ethical and legal psychologist, which is part of the reason that we asked for people to give a plan and all those types of things. Whereas if people were in an internship site, or if they were is it an exempt setting, CDRC? If you're in an exempt setting like CDRC, all those places typically have incredibly regimented programs of training with curricula, with certain performance standards, with regular evaluation of the supervisees, in a way, and they also go through a vetting process just to get into the placement in the first place. So there's a lot of oversight within those contexts. As I think about it, I certainly felt in many ways, this sounds strange, not that I always didn't feel accountable to do the best by the consumer, but I think I was more conscious of the constraints on me when I was in a formal internship or postdoctoral placement than I was when I was working with a supervisor in a private practice setting, even though I don't think we fundamentally did things differently. I just felt like there was more infrastructure in place to kind of observe what I was doing. So I do think that for some of these settings, like some of the exempt settings, and certainly in terms of formal internships and doctoral and postdoctoral placements, that there are a lot of checks and balances in place, and there's a lot of scrutiny of the behavior. Now, obviously, there's always exceptions to that rule. There can always be an internship site where perhaps they have the wrong motivation in having an internship site, et cetera, et cetera. But I think those are by far and away the exception to the rule as opposed to what the vast bulk of people are doing. So actually, this whole process has been very clarifying for me. I'm sure staff found it challenging and onerous, but I think you did a fantastic job of trying to summarize some of this stuff for us and put tags.
The organizing of it.
The
was
tags were
very
great. The tags were
Yeah.
particularly helpful. And I'm sure in some ways, as you saw the comments, you might have been seeing that the proposal might have been going down in flames, but but I think it was a good suggestion, and I think we're thinking along the right track, which is how do we best protect consumers in all circumstances where they're receiving mental health services by people that will ultimately be psychologists. But I think perhaps this proposal was a bridge too far. Is that the phrase?
That's a good analogy.
A quick question about thinking through the chart on page 30 of 533. And reflecting on your comments, Dr. Stevens, about the more formal and structured areas which an exempt setting would, page 30 of 533 in red.
Cool.
It makes for great reading, by the way, when you get an agenda this large. It passes a time really well at the airport. Given the more formal training settings that you mentioned versus the potentially less structured, I don't want to give the impression that they're not structured, I'm struck by the different months in terms of the maximum exemption period, and I'm curious to know, again, thinking back to the intent of the proposal, which is just a standardization of experience, why there was a 60-month exemption period for those two settings, the DMH waiver and the governmental organization and public school university. I'm just curious to know what the background of the 60 months is in that context.
I can try and, just from a statutory perspective, this was kind of a drill we went through a while back when we addressed people that were getting training in exempt settings with schools and government institutions. And at the time, there was a variance in the Welfare and Institutions Code, and I'm blanking, and the Health and Safety Code, thank you. And so in order to make and then also the penal code, and that was just cleaned up last year. So the legislature decided that it would be a good idea to make all the time limitations the same, so that because it was 3 years in one section, 5 years in another section. In our Practice Act, it was unlimited, so we just said across the board, let's make it 5 years. And then in the pathways language that we have proposed, we looked at the 72-month and made an amendment to make it 60 months as well. So that would make it all consistent, no matter what setting you're in, what kind of training you're getting. You have 5 years to get that experience under supervision of a licensed psychologist and then apply to the board.
Thank you for predicting what my next question was, Ms. Sork, which was the 60-month. Okay, that's excellent. And then just again, for question purposes, in thinking through for the discussion, just for discussion, is why would we put in the exemptions for those settings, but of course not for the other formal doctoral internship placements? Not saying that we would, but again, thinking through, explaining for folks why that doesn't have a maximum exemption period, so that there's a better understanding.
Those programs actually only last 1 year or 2 years. That's why. Yeah.
And I also think there's a consideration of
have a-
public resources in the sense that these are governmental organizations or university-based organizations that maybe we don't necessarily want to put an additional strain on the resources in providing training opportunities of this sort. Maybe I'm incorrect in that respect, but we don't charge them a fee, much like we don't for registered psychologists. And registered psychologists, in order to be a registered psychologist, typically they have to show the organization they're in has a certain percentage of government funding. So I think there was some consideration of impact on other public institutions, whereas a psychological assistant typically, historically, has been within the context of a private practice. And the internships themselves are quite expensive to run, from what I understand.
I think to that end, given this discussion, I think it might be helpful and again, I recognize that the chart that was developed on page 30 was in the context of the proposal, but I think it might help just for not discussion purposes, but for public purposes, to lay that out so folks have an understanding that we are in many ways trying to, we're endeavoring to do that standardization from a different perspective. Does that make sense? In other words, if we can enumerate, for example, what you just said about that setting of that formal doctoral internship placement setting on this chart, for example, when it says, we don't have a maximum exemption period because these are often 1 or 2 year programs, for example, or that we are standardizing that psychological assistant to 60 months. So that might help, I think, thinking through.
I think in our path, this is what we have now.
Right.
And this is available. I mean, people see this like on our website and stuff. But I think in our pathways, all of this is going to be, it's all in there, I think, and that'll be, and then if we create a chart to make it easier for folks, I think that's what you're talking about, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thinking through that final, I'm trying to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and so thinking through that final product of that, so that we have a measure of explanation for folks, so that it's easier to access, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. We can, as we go through pathways, we can definitely develop some materials that we can refer back. So it's almost like at a glance, at what is current and what is to be.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, great. So well, first of all, let me just I agree with you all. I want to thank everybody who sent in comments. They were extremely helpful, and we did learn a lot from the comments that you made, and I'm really happy that people are, when we ask for stakeholder input now, it seems like we're really starting to get it, and that's, we really, really appreciate that. So I just want to thank everybody who took the time to do that. I think probably we need a motion.
Actually, I have a question real quick, Dr. Horn. Is that okay?
Sure.
Just a question for staff. Reflecting on the comments that you received from the survey, and then thinking through the conclusion that you reached in your proposal, did you see what were your thoughts on that in terms of the original intent of the proposal and the comments that you received? Did you still see that there was a need from your perspective after reviewing the comments? And not to put you on the spot, so.
I think there are two sides of the coins, and certainly should the committee decide to go either way, we will have supporting comments from the stakeholders' input. So it's just a matter of what we can undertake right now, or what makes the best sense to approach this feedback right now. Currently, because it does involve a lot of different parties in the field of psychology, and we definitely don't want to create a barrier if we, whatever decision that the committee decide.
So, and let me also say, just as a reminder, we are also part of the public. Psychologists are, trainees are, educators are. We're also part of the public as well. It's not, and we keep saying consumers, but we're really talking about consumers, but also the public that we protect. So I think this is larger. All those, that's why we want input from all those groups and everything. So, yeah, I appreciate your response about that. So.
I did want to take an opportunity to, just for the purposes of transparency, there were some comments that were made that suggested that this was a money grab on the part of the Board of Psychology, that our purpose in doing this was to get an additional money. Trust me, $40 to process all the paperwork is it's not necessarily covering all the costs, probably even of staff time and everything that needs to go into it. But the reality is, we are a self-supporting board. We generate already enough revenue to cover all of our necessary and essential services. So we generally run with a surplus, if I'm speaking correctly, or have in most years in the past run with a surplus of money that goes into a fund, the psychology fund, but sometimes gets borrowed by has in the past gotten borrowed by the administration. So there'd be really we're not really looking for other sources of revenue. The only times we really discuss revenue is to make sure that revenues or fees are proportionate to the staff responsibilities for getting these things done, and also to make sure that they're proportionate with other types of fees that we're charging to other categories. So this was not motivated by money. This was motivated by concerns about consumers of psychological services and making sure that in some ways there was an accountability for all trainees. I think in many ways I feel satisfied that there is a level of accountability for all trainees, no matter which the categories they fall in, even though some of them are not registered with us.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to ask, is there a motion about what to do here?
Well, if I'm understanding the consensus is, in looking at the staff proposal, is that although the original staff proposal was to combine all 5 of these categories, that we're most interested in combining the registered psychologist and psychological assistant category under the name psychological assistant, and that we would like to move forward in that way in terms of looking at our pathways to licensure regulations and statutes. I don't know if that's a motion, but.
That's my understanding.
Okay.
So is that a motion?
Yes, I so move.
Quick question. I wonder, absolutely, to the consolidation of the registered psychologist and the psychological assistant. I would be curious to know if we can, as a potential tracking mechanism as we move forward, is if staff does see in the future a potential need for a category that brings folks under the board's oversight, that we potentially revisit that. Is that something that we can think through? And
And one of
amenable to.
one of the things you asked
So
for
wait a
last.
minute,
Oh,
there's a
sorry.
motion on the floor. Do you want to second it, and then we can talk some more?
We can do other motions.
Happy to second it.
Now, is there any more discussion?
So I think going back through just again thinking about the original intent of the proposal and to your point, Dr. Stevens, about why we even entertained in the first place from the consumer protection lenses, that we continue to monitor to see if there is a future need after this discussion for a potential consideration if we do see a problem that does come up.
And in that regard, it would be useful if we started collecting statistics. I don't know that we've done it this particular way. Statistics for complaints we receive where it involves a trainee that is in a non-registered category. So then we can really track whether we're seeing an emerging problem and whether we need to revisit it. But at present, I don't think we see the need to do that.
Okay, so that's not part of the motion, though. Okay. Any more discussion? I mean, I think that's a good idea. So any more discussion? Okay. Seeing none from us, let me ask, is there any public comment or public discussion about this motion? Dr. Emus.
I'm Dr. Immos from the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. I just wanted to add our thanks to you for the diligence and the hard work you've done and the level of collaboration with all of the stakeholders. We really appreciate this in the name of my own organization, our own organization, and the Department of State Hospitals with whom we've been collaborating. Thank you. This is an exemplary effort of members of the public and psychologists working together, and it is greatly appreciated. I want to give special thanks to Stephanie Chung. She's had to put up with me. My long-windedness, I'm right. But I really appreciate the work and the transparency, the information, and the clarity with which you provided information that helped us to work further than together when we went back to our institutions. Thank you for the survey. I appreciate the licensing board. I think this is a wonderful time to be able to work with you and be working together. I did want to introduce two people from our organization, and without them, of course, this wouldn't have been possible. This is our...
We can't hear you
Take the
unless
mic
you
with
speak
you.
in.
This is our assistant
Hi, I'm
director,
Deputy Director.
deputy director, sorry, Dr. Brizendine. And we really appreciate her. She's a very, very knowledgeable psychologist and also an MBA. So she adds to our organization unbelievable value, and it's also great working with you. Everybody was on board immediately and was able to gather information with your help. So I think the effort was ideal.
Thank you. And I just wanted to touch on kind of what you were talking about the formalized internship and accountability so just elaborate a little bit more. So with CDCR, of course, we have regulations that we have to follow. And we really do a two-prong approach when there is staff misconduct and for clinicians. So the one approach is going to be the referral to peer review. So we have a formal peer review committee at headquarters, and that's the clinical kind of approach. And the other approach is through discipline. So we have both the corrective action, which kind of comes before, and depending on the level of egregiousness of the misconduct, it could go directly to adverse action, which could lead ultimately in termination. So even though they're unregistered trainees, they're still governed by all of the rules and so forth through CalHR and the different regulations. So we're very strict and stringent on misconduct. So it seems to work pretty well.
I think we're really all on the same page, don't you?
Absolutely.
We're part of the state organization protector of the public. That means
right.
everybody.
That's right.
And that's number one in our mission, but also in yours. So that's why this makes this such a rich collaboration with various stakeholders who all have the same goal in mind. Thank
So
you.
thank you
Yeah,
so
thank
much for
you.
bringing us
Thank
in.
you very much, thanks.
I also, thank you, Brittany. I want to introduce Dr. Travis Williams. He's my immediate supervisor. He's now the chief psychologist of the statewide training unit.
Wow.
And we're over the internship program.
It's a lot of
How many
trainees.
times we've had really good interns, but there are always people who step over the line, and some people step over the line quite a bit. Have we wished to have a stronger bond with the Board of Psychology in dealing with these cases? Obviously, we report them as citizens' complaints, but we would welcome stronger working with you. You might want to think about how that might look and get back to us on that. We really appreciate that. But I think that in moving forward with our own training of people, we do also select people out pretty quick. It's a very complex place to work with a lot of different kinds of experiences, complex cases in different levels of care. The biopsychosocial model that we use as psychologists, understanding the person and conceptualizing a case with all of these pieces, takes on a really new meaning for mental health psychologists working at CDCR. And so we think that we know that we provide in a very interesting but difficult environment. Increasingly, well, it is state-of-the-art treatment. I have to make a plug, though, I'm sorry. So we have a new electronic health record. We've rolled it out now to all of the facilities. And we had, of course, the old DSM-4 TR going away. The GAF went away, right? So now what do we do? Because we were making some level of care determinations with the GAF. We're working with the Joint Commission.
You might want to say what GAF is
The
for
GAF
folks who.
is the general level of functioning, so it's the ability to function in a certain environment. And it was 1 to 100, and it wasn't really working very well. There was a lot of research on it, and people were just taking a number and plugging it in and putting the patient there just because, I don't know. But in any case, in our progression, particularly working with the Joint Commission standards, we have developed a test battery of evidence-based validated tests that we could use in corrections. The only problem was the suggestion in the DSM-5, which is also the original suggestion of the World Health Organization, to use their HUDAS, their Functional Disability Assessment Scale, didn't fit with corrections. We don't go to the bank, we don't take the bus in the prison, right, as a patient. And so I thought, well, gee, we ought to do something about this. So I had been following, before the DSM-5 came out, the progressions and the field trials. And I took their elements and I created a correctional version. And so we have actually been collaborating with the World Health Organization on this specialty version in Geneva, Switzerland. And we are going to start field trials on this. So if somebody is interested in really state-of-the-art psychological assessment, that's where we're moving to. We are looking forward to new interns and new postdoctoral trainees as well. And we have a lot to offer. We have a lot of different kinds of rotations and experiences. So I just had to put that in there. I'm sorry. But I'm really passionate about this. I've been working for the department for 14 years in various places, in prisons and headquarters. And I see an amazing amount of progression. As you pointed out, yes, there is a lot of structure. There are many levels, as Dr. Brizendine also said. Our peer review system is very stringent. So all in all, I think that the transparency and working together and being able to have the opportunity to provide the public and you with all of this material has been a great experience. Dr. Williams.
So one other piece I think that is important, we have been focusing a lot on how to train the postdoctoral trainees. Since I came on board with this position that I'm in now, we've also made a focused effort to train the supervisors so that they can provide adequate supervision to their trainees that they are supervising. So we have recently created a conference for our supervisors to educate them and provide techniques for case conceptualization supervision so that there's actual effort in understanding the patients and working collaboratively with the trainees on developing treatment goals and interventions that can be appropriate for their patients. So, and also, so there's a side of CDCR, the healthcare side, that has recently implemented a patient-centered medical home type model. So moving away from a standard medical model to a patient-centered model. We in mental health are making a concerted effort to join that complete care model as well. So there's a lot of collaboration that we can provide for other disciplines as well as we work as a holistic approach to our patients. So it's not just the body, it's not just the mind, but it's a mind-body connection. So all of this is hopefully preparing very qualified trainees to become supervised or to become licensed. And I know at the institutions, this is a very big effort as well. Before I was in this position, I was the chief of mental health at one of our institutions in the Central Valley. It's very hard to recruit there. So we would get a lot of candidates from Southern California that were here to basically get licensed. And then they would leave us. So I quickly recognized the need to develop a very strong training model as essentially we were a training facility. They would come in right out of school, spend the 2 or 3 years it took to get licensed, then leave us. So I wanted to make sure that we weren't creating people that were just there to get hours. So we made a very robust training program that went above just the individual supervision and the group supervision. We required a lot more supervision within a correctional setting. So there are obviously specialty skill sets that are required for corrections, and we wanted to impart those as well. So I think that we provide a lot of supervision to our staff. So I appreciate this oversight. But we are working very hard to make sure that we're producing qualified candidates for licensure.
And high clinical standard, so that even if our graduates, when they get licensed, want to try another type of setting, they've accumulated a lot of clinical knowledge that can be applied everywhere, not just in that setting.
So again, I want to thank y'all. I mean, you sent us a great a lot of good information about your processes there. I think it's great that you put so much effort into what you do, that you take training of future psychologists so seriously, and also their supervisors. I mean, that because we know there's a lot of literature and a lot of research about supervision and how to be a supervisor. I also just want to send a thank you for serving your gatekeeper function as well, because I think that doesn't necessarily happen at some places. So really appreciate that. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Any questions?
I guess I just had one comment more than anything else, and that's for the benefit of those who might be listening in today or people in the audience, that CDCR is the largest employer of psychologists in the state of California by far and away. I suspect they're probably also collectively the largest training site for internships.
Yes.
So it's very important, the work that you're doing there, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Dr. Winkelman?
Hi, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Winkelman with the California Psychological Association. I also want to thank the board staff and the board for doing such a thorough, thoughtful, flexible, and transparent job in looking at these issues of the paths to licensure. And also to thank the CDCR psychologists and other psychologists who have participated in this process. It does take a lot of flexibility to come up with a process that looks like it's going to be a lot better and see, oh my goodness, this is going to have all sorts of unintended consequences, and really take those seriously and go with and really change the direction that you're going. So I really appreciate that, and also the board, the committee, and the staff. I wanted to, in that mode of caution, also wanted to make a comment that I hope that the committee will also consider very carefully what does happen with the registered psychologists. And I know that there are not many of them, and I would want to make sure to look carefully at what are the comments that were received from the registered psychologists, and consider that before collapsing that into the psychological assistant category as well, because of the reasons that there was so much opposition for other categories becoming psychological assistants, mainly in terms of access to training, opportunities that may be already very good, and potentially access to care. So there were so many comments that I thought I had seen some in there about greater access to care because of the ability to be hired as a registered psychologist, but I can't put my finger on them right now. So I would urge the committee to really take a look at that before making even that change of the registered psychologist, because I also believe that they tend to serve in settings that receive a certain amount of state funding, I believe. So maybe populations in need of care that might not otherwise have access to care. And I also was struck by one other comment that among the many, which pointed out that recently, that if some of these regulations and laws are going to be changed, pointed out that recently the MFT trainees and other master's level trainees already, I believe, have this, are called MFT associates as opposed to assistants. So if we are looking at changing our psychology laws and regulations, I think it would be worthwhile to consider changing the name of the assistants to associates, because as it stands now, it does sound like a higher level, whereas our psychology trainees have a higher level of training than the associates on the master's level side. So I would hope that you could consider that as well. But so those are my comments, but mainly a thank you.
Thank you for those comments.
I did have one comment, and I don't think it's going to require further discussion, Dr. Winkelman. I know even when I was a psychological assistant that the category, the title itself felt like a bit of a come down. However, it did make it very clear that I wasn't a licensed professional. And really what we're trying to do is denominate that this is not a licensed professional you're dealing with. This is someone operating under somebody else's supervision. So it is part of the process of becoming a psychologist that we may have to tuck our tail between our legs a little bit and recognize that we haven't arrived yet at the point where it's going to sound like we're practicing psychology unsupervised. So
I don't know that associate.
Makes any difference?
I mean, I think this is another issue, you know, we can talk about it, certainly when we go to the pathways, but I tend to agree. I think associate sounds more
Professional?
It does sound more professional and more in line with psychologist training. That's just, but that, you know, because I agree, a psychological assistant, I mean, it's okay, you know, but I think if other groups are going to associate in part, and already our training is more, you know, it's a higher level of training to start with. So I don't know, I think it's worth discussing, maybe.
And I would
If I-
also say, I do hope you'll discuss it, and I think there are a lot of other safeguards that are in place to assure people that they know you are not yet an independently licensed psychologist, that you're under supervision, it's already required, you can't call yourself a psychologist. So I think there are many other ways, and I certainly, I wouldn't consider it, I think there are many other ways to avoid confusion, and that the title associate, psychological associate.
I don't have a predetermined position on this, and I'm more than willing to discuss it when we get to
Yeah.
pathways, because
That's for later.
this really
Yeah.
isn't a subject of this particular,
Right. Okay.
particular motion. But
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
I don't know, to me, it's just semantics, and it sounds like a kind of like a false, I don't see the distinction, but we can talk about it further.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when we do talk about it further, I think it might be helpful to go back to our notes that we got from Solid, because I think that was discussed, at least in Southern California, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that was for registered psychologists, I think, what to call them. Yeah.
was also a discussion.
Was it psych assistants as well? Okay, great. Thank you.
Comment? Hi, Jackie, Dr. Horn.
Mr. Pugliati.
Renee Pugliati from CAPIC. Don't represent APIC or APA, but some of this, we're similar in some ways in terms of we are formal internships. And from our point of view as CAPIC, we do provide a lot of these oversights that other people have talked about, CDCR puts together. And we don't have a lot of evidence of complaints from our interns. And that's probably because of what we do while we're there. We work with the sites, the schools, and the supervisors along with and the students. But I want to step back and say, I want to echo what everyone else said about the process. I want to also emphasize for the administration and Natasha, to Stephanie, Antoinette, everyone, that keep trying to improve the system and standardize as much as you can. It seemed like from some of the survey questions there's so much of a pushback, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, because it caught people by surprise after the stakeholder meeting, that it wasn't really discussed, and all of a sudden what's being proposed is a consolidation of categories, which threw people off. And I think that also the way that some of it was presented, I think there are opportunities for standardization and definitely benefits for it. It's possible that registration could mean different things for different categories for people who have different levels of oversight already. Psych assistants don't have that oversight, but the other categories do, so perhaps a different level of registration might work. Because you wanted statistics on what complaints where they're coming from, and hard to get the statistics on how many people are in these different categories if they're not registered. Hard to get statistics on complaints if they're not registered, so I definitely see from the staff point of view the benefits of that. I also see the benefits of it in terms of someone going to a different state. When someone another state board will contact me regarding someone who's gone to a CAPIC internship because it doesn't meet, it's not APA accredited, and so it doesn't meet certain standards. And I send out information to them saying, well, this is what we provide, this is the oversight we provide, these are our standards. Ideally, that would be coming from the state, or at least part of it could come from the state, so that it's a state licensing board talking to another state licensing board. And you're not going to get there if it's totally separate, if what we do is totally separate from what you do. So I definitely see the benefits on some level of registration, although our organization is very pleased to hear that you're not going to do it at this time. But I want to just, again...
Enough's enough, huh?
Yeah, I just want to encourage the staff to continue to look at standardization, how to make it smarter for everyone involved. And I guess the last thing is that it's always a balance between protection of the public and access to care for the public. And everyone, as you heard from in the surveys and today, we were concerned about the second half of it. And I really appreciate the board hearing us, so thank you.
Thank you. All right, any other public comment? Any other comment? Oh, I'm sorry, yes, come forward.
My name is Chris Davis. I'm a doctor of psychology. I am not yet licensed, and I would like to bring the perspective of someone working through the process. I would like to express my tremendous gratitude for any efforts to simplify and clarify, and for starting to have these meetings and opening them up to the public. Yeah, that just hearing you guys have this discussion has helped me to clarify the question that I have. So I'm going to just not take up this esteemed body's time, but I just wanted to express my gratitude and say that from the perspective of someone who is trying to achieve licensure, it has, if I had known that, and this is a population that I have served and I'm very interested in serving, if I had known how egregious this process was going to be, I would have absolutely positively, hands down, chosen another route to be in service to vulnerable populations. This has been just an atrocious experience in so many ways. It has been such a growth and learning opportunity that I'm ultimately grateful for it in the end. But my final question would be, is there a recourse if you feel that your supervisor has been, if I wanted to make a complaint against a supervisor, that we feel very much as if we have no recourse whatsoever? Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Certainly, I think a trainee can certainly bring a complaint against a supervisor. I don't think there's anything that prohibits that from happening. Anyone can file a complaint at any time. The one concern you have as a trainee or as a professional bringing that type of complaint is that you don't want to be revealing the identity or confidential information about a particular case. Because you have your own obligations in terms of confidentiality. So it becomes kind of a bit of a sticky wicket, but if it's an overall question about inappropriate supervision, those types of things, you certainly have wide latitude in that regard.
Anybody can bring a complaint against any psychologist for any reason. So that's going to be kind of the bottom line. I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to it. So any concerns or complaints that you have can be brought to the board. Yeah. So, and if, but also thank you for your feedback, and I'm sorry the process has been such a difficult one for you, but hopefully it'll get easier.
I'm hearing more people who are sharing my experience than not.
Okay, well, thanks. Again, I'm going to say anyone can bring a complaint against any psychologist at any time. So
I'll follow through on that. The problem is that when your hours are in the balance and your supervisor is saying, I'm not going to give you any hours, then you're just like, okay, I'll take what you're going to give me, cut my losses and run.
Understood. You know, again, I'll just make that comment and we'll move on forward. So it's complex for sure.
Dr. Horn, real quickly,
Yeah.
one of the comments that I think Dr. Stevens made about asking staff to think of a way to track complaints against trainees, is that what I heard?
Complaints against trainees in non-registered categories.
And that doesn't need a motion per se. Okay, that's helpful. And I do think that seemed to be a recurring theme in this conversation. And I think, Dr. Amos, you had mentioned that you would welcome a stronger collaboration between the two. And that's something that struck me, just given, now that I have Dr. Stevens' really great fact about how CDCR is the largest employer of psychologists. So thank you, Dr. Stevens. But I just think about the vulnerable population that you work with and who can make a complaint when, is it a family member who's hearing through a visit? Is it through the actual person itself? And the process and the fact that you do have a process already in place to make sure that those folks don't move on your program is fantastic. But I think to Dr. Amos's point, I think there is a value at some point in thinking about how that we track those persons because they may fall out of your program because they didn't meet your standards and find a place that doesn't necessarily have as high expectations as you do. And so I think for us to better understand in the future, and if they're not obviously in the system already because we're tracking it via their supervisor, that is a bit of a concern to me. And so I do want to think through, not at this time and as a conversation of pathways, but I think as a larger question. Maybe it's a different committee as an enforcement issue, I don't know. But I do think that's something that struck me in this conversation here today.
Yeah, thanks for that. Sure.
Again, Brittany Brizendine. We have, as any good correctional system would have, a appeal process. So every patient has the right to file appeals. We call them 602s. So we have a healthcare appeal for all medical, mental health, dental care, and then there's the custody appeals. So there's first level, second level, and third level. So it's not that uncommon for patients to file appeals. We have very strict timelines where we have to answer the appeals. The patient has to be interviewed. And many of them are like level of care decisions. I want to be in this level of care or so forth, or maybe I want a different clinician, or, and then they're answered generally by the supervisor. If the patient does not agree with the outcome, like if it's either partially granted or not granted, many of them are partially granted, then they will, they have the right to file a second level. And then it gets to all the way up to the third level, which comes to us at headquarters, which we review. And then once the patient exhausts the whole appeal process, they then have the right to go through the whole federal court system where they can, bring a formal lawsuit, basically. So we have a lot of internal systems where the patients can very timely have their complaints heard and answered.
Concurrent with that process, the board can take a complaint from a correctional inmate at any time, and in fact, we do receive a lot of complaints from correctional inmates.
All right, any more discussion on this motion, which is, can you read the motion back? Who's got it?
I have it written as to, it's a motion to change registered psychologist to psychological assistant within the pathways to licensure changes.
Okay.
Could you read that again?
To change the registered psychologist designation or to combine it into the psychological assistant designation within the broader pathways to licensure discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, seeing no more discussion, Mr. Glass-Steagall, will you call the?
I will. Fu?
Aye.
Horn?
Aye.
Phillips?
Aye.
Passes.
Okay, thanks. All right, so it's almost 10:30. We're done with this piece. Why don't we take a 10-minute break? Okay. Be back at 10:35.